Hi all, welcome to today's HIPAA Top 5 Security Gaps webinar. My name is Jack Ardrey and I will be moderating today's program, which is brought to you by Charles IT. Charles IT is a leading compliance expert and managed IT service provider in Middletown, Connecticut. We are recording today's session, so all attendee lines are muted. Once the webinar concludes, all attendees will receive an email that provides a copy of the presentation and a link to the recording of today's webinar. Our program will begin with a presentation. Following this presentation, we will have a question and answer session. You can submit any questions you have throughout the presentation via the Q&A button on your screen. We have a large audience with us today, so our presenter will likely not get to all of your questions. He will work to follow up on those questions that he does not have the opportunity to address. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Tom Tetrault. Tom is a team lead and project manager at Charles IT, as well as one of our high-level compliance experts. Tom has been in this position with Charles IT almost 5 years now. He has had experience in highly regulated industries for years and has had an experienced background in helping businesses of all sizes to prepare for their respective compliances. It is now my pleasure to turn the floor over to Tom.
Good afternoon, everybody. Excited to have everyone here today for our HIPAA webinar. Excited to kind of walk through a few items. So today we're going to be talking about HIPAA background. What is HIPAA? Why does it matter to you? And does it affect you at all? Top 5 security gaps for HIPAA, the items that we see when we're working with new clients or doing assessments for users that are organizations that are affected by HIPAA and need to be compliant. That HIPAA gap assessment and what such a process would look like, and different security services that would overlap with common gaps that we see. At the end, we'll be concluding with a little bit of question and answer. So Jack is going to be keeping an eye on that Q&A button to see what users are submitting. And then we'll have a time just to wrap up any closing thoughts, pending any items that may come in. So what is HIPAA? HIPAA, we've all heard the phrase, is an act that was passed strictly with rights to patients in mind. So health organizations, specifically covered entities, are organizations that are holding data, manipulating data that respectively is tied to healthcare and patient information. And bringing these rights to these patients and protecting that data as we migrate into a digital era is very important. HIPAA compliance is governed by the Department of Health and Human Services. And as mentioned, it requires that we keep patient information safe, private health information, and it's increasingly important now that most data is held electronically. So for me, I always think of, you used to go into a doctor's office and you see these filing cabinets, behind the counter and lining the back. And as a patient comes in, they're sorting by letter, they're pulling out that physical copy. That data is increasingly through multiple organizations moving into the digital world. There's no longer a physical requirement to access that data, but any device that's connected to the internet is exposed to some level, and making sure that that data is protected from those exposures, from those vulnerabilities, and from any bad actors that may be out there trying to access that data. And even for non-HIPAA compliance or organizations that are not covered entities, a covered entity being a health plan, a healthcare provider, or a healthcare clearinghouse, it's always the recommended platform to use this if you're manipulating patient data, specifically health data for a patient. So in a scenario where you may not be directly governed by the HIPAA requirements, if you're not a covered entity, it's still important to protect that data, both ethically as well as organizationally for your customers and patients. So number one is safeguarding data. Users frequently leave their computers logged in while they walk away from their desks. So how many of us have known that coworker that gets up and they run to the bathroom, or they're getting themselves a fresh cup of coffee, they walk back to the computer and they sit down, no need to type in a password. That's a security risk. We have physical controls that we'll be looking at and monitoring in our organization. You lock doors, etc. But as these computers are connected into the internet, there is the ability for that access to be manipulated remotely as well. A recent scenario that ties to that was there was a water treatment plant that had been accessed remotely. And it used some vulnerabilities in a few different applications and an end-of-life operating system. But what it allowed someone to do is to connect into this environment fully remotely and monitor and adjust what chemicals were being added to the water. So, not getting into the details of that, but using it as an example to show that even while we are physically at our desks, the ability for someone to access a computer remotely is possible. We use this as an IT service provider, we use this to connect to your computers remotely. We're signing in, it's an authenticated platform, and we have proper security measures in place to ensure that our access is protected. However, there's a number of applications that grant this access to individuals or home users that can frequently be installed on computers and can be granting other users, whether it's an service provider and support, maybe it's for an application that your environment uses, or it's an application that a user had improper access rights to their computer and they were able to install that can be used maliciously, both by the person who installed it themselves, whether it's the support or whether it's an employee in the organization, but also can be potentially manipulated. So leaving our computers unlocked, even if there's physical security, is still a security risk in the environment. And also looking at, preventing unauthorized access. So tying it back to, what I was mentioning is, both physically and digitally, access can be granted, through manipulating different applications or programs that are deployed. So how can we prevent unauthorized access? The physical component is walking through the building during and after business hours. So I'm sure many of us are familiar with the idea of a clean desk policy. That documents that can't be held out, whether it's for compliance or organizational policies, are put away. So a physical walkthrough to make sure that doors are locked, computers are locked, etc., is one method that we have to do that. The other is ensuring auto locking on all technology. So whether that is a computer that we're working on and we're checking our email, accessing the web, or that's a corporate device that's mobile. It could be a tablet that a service provider is using in a patient's home to track their medical data. Ensuring that there's administrative policies that lock that technology is important. We as humans can go through all the proper trainings and we can be made aware, but making sure that there's something enforcing these policies is going to be important. And giving the proper training to our teams to ensure that they're up to date on the latest. So it's technology and security is a little game of cat and mouse. As we are putting in extra precautions, the bad actors out there are looking for ways to get around them and manipulate them. So the number one component that we can do is train our staff to look for the right things, understand the best practices, whether it's physical or digital in our environments. Next is monitor controls. And for this there's a lot of information that's happening on the day-to-day, and all of our digital actions, they leave a trace. There's breadcrumbs left behind. So for anyone who's used a VPN, a VPN is to allow a connection from a remote device back to a corporate network, allowing that corporate information to be securely transferred between your terminal, your computer, and the servers that are on-prem on your server, or potentially even hosted in a cloud environment. When we connect to that VPN, we're leaving a trace and we're leaving logs on our, you guys may have heard, firewall, and it's showing who accessed, where did they access from, potentially what credentials did they access with. Beyond that, there's also logs on the server. So when you open a file, delete a file, copy a file, there's traces that are left behind. So ensuring that those logs are being captured and they're being handled appropriately is vital. And using access controls for HIPAA compliance. And when we're talking about this specifically, really what we're talking about is that log retention is required for 6 years on HIPAA compliant customers, or those covered entities that you have. So if your organization is a covered entity, you're holding patient data, you're one of the 3 categories that we talked about previously, there's a requirement that these logs are being held for up to 6 years. And beyond that, upgrading to newer systems. So there's older systems out there that may not have logging or may not have compatible logging with the systems that we're using. So ensuring that those are up to date. Also ensuring that any security vulnerabilities, security patches, and application development that ties to those is being completed as well. So how do we capture all of these logs? How do we retain them for 6 years? And what we use is we use a SIM agent, and it's an endpoint, or it's a service that attaches to all of the different endpoints, your desktops, your servers, your networking equipment, and also potential other devices in specific circumstances. And what it does is 2 main things. It takes all of these logs that are happening independently of each other, and it ties them together. So we're able to look at those logs all together, one perspective. When someone accessed the VPN at this time on this date, they then touched these files on our server and took these actions. So consolidating them is item number 1, and the other is being able to actually look at them in comparison to each other. So file access in and of itself may not be a concern, but we may be concerned on where that file access or that remote access over the VPN itself is coming from. If we are a US organization and we're seeing VPN traffic from foreign countries, especially some that may be cybersecurity threats, being able to capture those and tag some monitoring to them is important. So for a SIM agent, it's really post-event analysis and being able to go and pull all of those different pieces together in the event of a scenario or some sort of breach or incident that may have happened, and connect all those dots, be able to tell a story as to what happened, how that person walked through our environment, and being able to actually have clarity to that versus saying, we had a breach and we just don't know what happened. So that's where the log retention happens is, a breach may not be found day 1, a breach may be found weeks later, months later, or even in some cases, years later. Item number 3 is access controls. And access controls may seem obvious. We only give access to those who need it, but it goes a little bit deeper than that. So, making sure that any access to a system or location that houses PHI is being properly protected with a password. Leaving a system open with no password, as I'm sure we all can agree, is the same as leaving the house on our front door unlocked. And tying to that, a poor password is really only good at keeping the innocent out. So I'm sure we've all seen those top most common password lists, and it's password 123, or we've used a password at some point in our lives where it's our dog's name, our kid's name, our hometown, followed by the number 1 and an exclamation mark. That's not going to stop a true bad actor from doing some sort of brute force access where they're just cycling through a password dictionary, etc. What we want to do is ensure that passwords are meeting the proper complexity requirements. And what we want to do with that is make sure that a user can't reuse the same password. So if your password was something one day and then it rotates at the next set sequence, that you can't set it right back to that same thing, same exact password. We also want to make sure that passwords are meeting certain length requirements, complexity requirements. We talked about brute forcing, a scenario where an application or a bad actor is running through a large amount of passwords, accepting that most of them are going to fail, with the hopes that they strategically get to the right password that lets them in. Computers can do this faster, and with that, longer passwords is kind of the magic recipe now. So we used to historically replace a E with a 3 or an S with a $sign, with the idea of making it complex enough to, maybe our neighbor, that they're not going to know which right combination that we did. But if a password's only 3 letters long, it's going to be pretty easy for a computer to quickly go through all of the possible combinations until they land on that proper one. Password complexity requirements are also looking at common words, making sure that we have limitations that I can't use my own first name in the password, or potentially that I can't use the organization's name in the password. Any common words that a bad actor would be able to use to manipulate that system. Auto-locking accounts is also important. We touched on this a little bit on our previous slides, but ensuring that even if I do try to sign in, or a computer system is running through a large list of passwords, that my account will lock in after a set of circumstances, so that new attempts at login cannot be passed through to the server for authentication. So what this looks like in most organizations is you put in your password up to a certain amount of times, and then your account locks out. So if you put in your password incorrectly 5, 7 times, whatever the policy aligns with, it will say no more passwords can be tried until another circumstance comes into place. In many cases, that's contacting your IT company and saying, hey, I've unlocked myself, and that gives them the ability to do a proper authentication of the user, verify that the person trying to reset the password is the person who it belongs to. And then once that's been confirmed and approval has been granted to that party, the password can be reset. That way they can access that system again. Ensuring that logs are made of failed login attempts. So our logging isn't very good if we don't know when they happened. So the system is great, it's stopping people from signing in, but we also want to make sure that we're capturing when these are happening, and that there's certain triggers put in place for when an alert may be triggered. If we see an account that is trying to sign onto a computer and they've guessed their password wrong 1, 2, 3 times, in many cases, someone's having a bad day, they're hitting the wrong button, their brain's just not triggered properly. But if we see that someone's tried signing into a system 300 times, that's a flag for us. And that's something that we want to be looking at and identifying what is happening. Is this truly a malicious activity, or is there a misconfiguration somewhere that's causing all of those attempts? In the scenario where you have a complex password, you have lockout requirements, there's still the possibility of that account being spread. So we've all heard of phishing. Email phishing is, you get an email, someone is misleading you as to who they are. They put a link in the email, you click it, you go to sign in, and after you've put in your username, after you've put in your password, we find out that it didn't bring you where you thought it was going to go to. And this website was malicious in design to be able to capture your username and capture your password. How do we protect that? And that's the current gap. Is in what we're seeing day to day right now is it's human error. It's right time, wrong place. A series of events brings us to it. A story that I frequently tell on this is, your Netflix account goes to expire and that email comes to you. You're not going to think twice of it. Maybe I had a poor timing of sequence of events. Your credit card happened to have been breached. You canceled it. Now a Netflix email comes through. Your payment information isn't correct. You're going to link those two together, and you're going to say, yes, I believe this. Absolutely, I canceled my credit card. Carry that same possibility over into any business application. If the right two events happen to align, it lowers our guards a little bit. Through the training, our goal is to identify those and train users as to what those are and what they look like. But as a last line of defense, what we recommend is multi-factor authentication. And this is strictly to ensure that the person putting in the username and the person putting in a password into an application, a website, is who they say they are. And we do this by having a third step to grant access. So on my cell phone, and you guys can't see it, but I'm waving it around. On my cell phone, I have an application that's tied to my identity. So anytime on configured applications and websites that I sign in, I put in my username, I put in my password, and the system then pushes a notification strictly to the one device, my cell phone, and says, hey, we've got your username, we've got your password, but is it really you? And it's looking for that extra verification that I am me. I have to be able to unlock my cell phone. I'm the only person who can do that. And as you can see in the lower left-hand corner of the slide, I have to hit that yes button saying, yes, I do grant access to this. I did have an authentication attempt to sign into whatever website or application it may be. And then once that third piece there, that physical component, my cell phone on my person, grants access, then it can be passed through. And access is then granted properly. The other is the mindset of least privilege access and ensuring that permissions in any application, in any actual system itself, is only being granted to the level that is needed for that job, function, or role to be completed. So if I am a technology guy, I'm your IT support contact, you reach out, we're helping out. I don't need access to Charles IT's financial records, thus it's not granted. And that in and of itself tends to be more of a clearly defined permission. Beyond that, it starts to get a little more complex of what folders, what access, what applications do I need? And once I'm in that application, what functions do I actually need to be able to perform my job or my job duties? So ensuring that access is only being granted to the minimum level required. Next is vendor management functions. And as I talk through this, I want everyone to start thinking through the items that they specifically have vendors that perform functions for. Do you have a payroll processing company or a payment processing company, even better, for your patient services where that's outsourced? Do you have different applications, cloud-based line of business applications, CRMs, etc.? And as you go through that list, ask yourself, do I have a business associate agreement? And when's the last time, if I do, when's the last time that was audited? When did I look at it? Do we know what it contains, etc.? So for anyone who may not be aware, a business associate agreement is a document outlining between the service provider and the customer, in this case your organization, responsibilities of each party to protect the data that's being transferred. So similar to our internal to our environment, permission access. Who needs access to what files, who needs access to what permissions. We have something similar on the BAA side where we're looking to meet the minimum standard, or only the least amount of data that needs to be transferred to that third party is being done. If it's an external payment processing, they will need a customer or a patient's name. They may need a phone number or an email address, but do they need any other health information on that user? In many cases, the answer is no. In this document, that's one of many items that would be outlined as, what data is being passed along, as well as what are the responsibilities? Is my data going to be encrypted so that it can't be read? Who's my data going to be shared with once I put it into your platform? And going through this process, we get a BAA from one party, we get a BAA from another. It's important to ensure that these are all being held to similar standards so that we know confidently that our patient's data that's being transferred to these third parties is being held the same, whether it's company 1, company 2, or company 3. And it's important that these BAAs aren't set it and forget it, but rather that we look at the life cycle of these vendors and of these agreements that are put in place, and we're frequently reviewing them on a regular basis to ensure that that data and those agreements don't need to be changed, to make sure that we're up to date on how these vendors are accessing this different data. And making sure that we have an opportunity to update those if they were to be needed. Next is incident response. So for us, an incident is anything where there's a breach of system, a breach of data. And it's important that whether it's a system going down or a breach that happens, that data is being protected, and that we are all aligned, both any service providers, any vendors, as well as internally at your organization, as to what happens next. So most important for this is having a disaster recovery plan. 2020 threw us all a little bit of a loop. We had COVID come in, and while not a disaster or while not an incident, it's gotten a lot of us thinking about how do we access our systems if something happens? If I'm forced to work remotely, what does that look like? And the next level on this is what happens if there's truly a disaster? What happens if a system goes down? What happens if our internet goes down and we can't just access the web and our web-based systems? If a server goes down and our entire organization is unable to access that data? And it's important that beyond just writing this policy for a run book on these scenarios, that we're also ensuring a standard protocol will be followed regardless of who's available. So if you have a designated person internally to be your disaster recovery point person, maybe it's a site manager, maybe it's another role, maybe it's a dedicated IT person, it's an outsourced IT provider, who does what and when do they do it? What systems come up first? What systems are prioritized? What are the responsibilities of each party during a true disaster situation? And having a document that outlines that and shows the thought has gone into that makes the difference in how quickly an organization can be up and running after a disaster happens. It's important to make sure that a disaster recovery plan is tested. Having it on paper is awesome, but if it's not tested, how much time goes by before it's reviewed? Does everyone actually remember what is in it? And once it's time to execute on it, is it going to work as designed? One thing that I like that we do on our backups is every day we verify that every server's been backed up, standard practice. But beyond that, we're also verifying that servers that we back up have been able to be virtualized or spun up in a digital environment separate from the environment that backup is captured. That gives us confidence that if something were to happen to a building, fire, flooding, and take the physical hardware offline, that we actually have a copy of that server, a copy of that data that can be spun up so your business can return back to normal. As discussed, priority. What servers need to come online? Who needs to be communicated to? How are we going to handle rescheduling customer appointments? All of these items are items that may make it into your plan with the pure goal of ensuring that services are restored as quickly and efficiently as possible so that you can get back to doing what you do best, serving your patients. Separately, having an information security specific recovery plan is also important. So previously I was talking about, buildings, servers, weather, all of these different items that may come up. But what happens if there's a breach and your patient's data is compromised? What are the next steps in such of a scenario? So for us, having these incident plans, having these disaster recovery plans is a frequent gap. It is, for me, similar to a life jacket under your seat on an airplane. It's the item that you want to be there, and if you ever need it, you will sure be glad it is there, but that may not be used frequently. So it's important that they're developed, they're reviewed, they're tested, and hopefully we never need to use them, but we will all have the confidence that in a scenario that does require it, that it's been tested and every team member in that disaster recovery plan or in that incident response plan are aligned with what their next steps are and what they need to do. So today we've highlighted 5 of the most common gaps that we see, 5 of the most common items that aren't configured at all, aren't configured to best practices, and maybe items that are of concern when an actual incident were to happen. Again, bringing this all back to HIPAA, the intent is to protect patient information, specifically patient health information. So first step in coming compliant in such a scenario is to run a gap assessment. And with a gap assessment, what that party is going to do is they're going to take their knowledge, their wealth of knowledge, specifically in HIPAA compliance, HIPAA rule sets, and they're going to compare them to your existing environment. This is going to give you a snapshot in time. This is our starting point. Here's how each item aligns. To piggyback on an earlier example, let's say you don't have a screen lock program in place. So I can walk away from my computer, never lock it, and then come back 24 hours later. And as long as there's no power settings putting my computer to sleep, I can just sit down and pick up right where I left off. No password. A gap assessment is going to say, here's your current configuration. Computers don't automatically lock. And here's the recommended solution for your environment, keeping HIPAA compliance in mind. And that will go through a list of many items to ensure that we know where you are and you have clarity on where you are and where you need to be to ensure that you're HIPAA compliant. That party will also help with prioritizing those gaps and ensuring that the biggest risks are the ones that are addressed first, building a roadmap of sort. Highest priority, these are your biggest targets, and then working your way down to the items that you still need to accomplish, but they're not the biggest risks to your organization. And a gap assessment is going to help you understand what you need to do to fill those gaps. In certain circumstances, such as a screen lock, it's pretty black and white. Here's the requirement, here's what we need to do. There's other areas that are not so clear, and with them, it's a guidance, or really what the HIPAA compliance is looking to ensure is that you have a policy in place. It's not necessarily specifying what that policy says, but it does want to ensure that you have a policy in place that aligns with industry best practices in most cases, and that you're abiding by that policy as well. All of this being done, first and foremost, to protect patient information. But also organizationally, it's important to know that going through this process will help you not just protect that patient information, but also to ensure that going into any HIPAA audits that were to take place, that you're very well postured for them, showing that you've already taken all of these items and you've put your security practices in place, and also showing that that effort's been put into place to get the organization to be 100% compliant beyond just any items that may have been taken care of up to that point. And it's important that going through a gap assessment, that timelining is looked at. All of these items can't be flipped on overnight. Depending on the scope and depending on your gap assessment is really what's going to determine the priority and the timeline needed to require all of those information. And organizationally, speaking for myself and speaking for Charles IT, data security is very important to us. And we see it on a regular basis that doesn't necessarily carry true to everybody. And a recent example for me was my son is switching the programs that he's in and which preschool he's going to. And going through that process, they have a bunch of information that they're looking for, and it's private information regarding your life or regarding your family. And some of it's easy, some of it's names, some of it's addresses, some of it's birth dates and other information of that nature. Some of it's more sensitive, tied to myself. Going the extra, having the knowledge from the training and having the awareness of what's possible and why we need to take these precautions is important. So in my case, going back to this daycare, they're not a covered entity. They don't provide health care, but I am sending them all of this information, and being able to do so through an encrypted email to be able to protect myself and protect my data, for me, was common sense. For me, it was exactly what I needed to do. I understood what data was in there. I understood the risk of sending it. And I also understood that I don't necessarily have good insight into their environment and how my data is going to be protected. So I took those extra precautions. But not everyone knows how to do that. And once the data is in your hand, it's also your responsibility to ensure that it's protected through HIPAA. So just a little story there to kind of tie it all back, that even though it's not directly a HIPAA organization or it's not healthcare, that data is still exchanging hands on a regular basis. And once that information is sent over email, the patient doesn't have control of what's there. So ensuring that both, legally we're meeting our requirements, but also giving customers and patients the peace of mind that their data, once sent to your organization, is secure, will help everybody sleep a little bit better at night. So summarizing some of the items that we talked about today, there's a few services that we work with and we're pretty intimate with that help offset some of these items. Spot checked or spot talked about some of these on the given slides, but do want to take a moment to kind of loop back and refresh everyone on what they are and where they may help protect. Multi-factor authentication. This is a third form of verification in addition to your username and password that's integrated with different websites or platforms, even your local computer, to ensure that the person signing on is the person whose identity belongs to that device. Most common, we do this through an app on our phones. Some of you who have used this previously may have previously used like a keychain dongle that's been provisioned to you. It's a physical security item used to verify your identity in addition to a username and a password. SIM. SIM is logging consolidation. So we're taking the logs from the firewall, taking the logs from the server, putting them into one place, storing them offsite so that retention compliance requirements are met, and ensuring that the data from those logs is being reviewed with the other pieces in place. So firewall logs, the firewall's looking at just the firewall logs. The server's looking at just the server logs. A SIM platform is going to take those logs, retain them offsite for the required amount of time, as well as ensure that those logs are being looked at together to paint a bigger picture and identify post-event analysis after the fact what may have happened and help kind of connect all of those dots. Security awareness training. Ensuring that the members of your organization, your teammates, your employees, are given the proper training and refreshers once they've had that training on different aspects of technology. So a typical security awareness training platform is going to go through and it's going to do phishing testing. We talked about those sneaky emails that make you think it's one thing, but really it's someone trying to collect your username and password, and identifying what to look for in those circumstances. It's also going to be able to you'll be able to leverage this platform for industry related trainings. So being able to do a HIPAA refresher, or when you're onboarding a new employee, being able to enroll them into a HIPAA training as is. And having a testing and training component as well to keep everyone on their toes. So going through the training once isn't enough, but being able to send tests out, such as a malicious email, to those employees and determine if everyone is up to it. If they've taken their training, they've implemented, did they open that email? Did they click the link? Did they download those files? And using such a platform to identify places where additional training can be used upon a failure. So it, again, will be very targeted to your organization, but ensuring that repeat training is happening on a regular basis when looking at a calendar year or life change events, such as coming into an organization, but also as needed based on that testing that's happening. Next is desktop encryption. So we have all that data. We have this customer data, the patient data, and it's out there floating around. It's stored in our systems. We've managed access administratively and determined who can and who cannot access that. But what happens to the data while it's sitting there on the actual physical computer? If I have a laptop and I'm traveling for business, I'm working on it, I slide it into the seat back of the airplane seat in front of me, deboard the airplane, I don't know where that computer is. More importantly, I don't know what data is on that computer or who would have access to it afterwards. What encryption does is it ensures that if someone gets our computer, the data on it is safe. The data on it cannot be read and written. Someone can't pull that hard drive out and plug it into their computer unless they were to have the decryption key, which is long and no one's going to memorize it. No one's going to walk around with it. So that specific scenario is not likely to happen. But without that encryption key, that data is useless unless they have a supercomputer beyond what any normal person would have access to. That key isn't going anywhere. And these platforms are designed to ensure that that is the case. Different platforms will have different functionality as well. So tying it to a lost computer, encryption is just the protection of the data, but different encryption platforms will have different functionality, specifically allowing you to say, hey, I've lost this computer, please wipe this drive the next time it comes online or connects to the internet, if so were to happen. So once we have the data, being able to actually protect it and know that the data is being stored both at rest on a disk encryption or your computer, but also understanding through our communications with our vendors and outlining those BAs, how data is going to be transferred between organizations, ensuring that it's safe while in transit.
Thank you, Tom, for a highly informative presentation. Knowing the HIPAA compliance security gaps can be essential for a healthcare's business in their success, and there have been plenty of key takeaways from this program. With that being said, we'll now begin the Q&A. As a reminder, you can submit any questions you have via the Q&A button on your screen. There are many questions, and Tom will likely not get to all of them, but we will work to follow up those questions that he does not have the opportunity to address. So, first question for Tom here. What type of information is considered PHI?
Thanks, Jack. So PHI is information that is collected from an individual by a covered entity that relates to the past, present, or future health or condition of an individual, and either identifies the individual or there's basis to believe that the information can be used to identify, locate, or contact said individual. There are 18 main identifiers, but this information most commonly is going to be names, phone numbers, email addresses, photos, and even go as far as to say an IP address. Your address when you connect to the internet, if it's tied to that user specifically, is considered PHI.
Great, thanks, Tom. Next question we got here, who actually carries out the HIPAA audits?
That would be the Department of Health and Human Services Office for Civil Rights. They will do the actual periodic audits for any HIPAA compliant organizations.
Excellent. And for our final question of the day here, for HIPAA security rules, do I need to encrypt all of my organization's emails?
On a technical basis, no, not every email leaving your organization needs to be encrypted. However, any data that does contain sensitive information, PHI, should be encrypted both as a best effort, but also so that it doesn't lead to a higher chance of a HIPAA violation from that data leaving your hands and into the wrong.
Great. I appreciate that, Tom. And that is all the time we have for questions today. If you did happen to submit a question that was not asked during the Q&A, it will be provided to Tom along with your contact information for a follow-up. Before we conclude here today, I want to give Tom an opportunity to share some of his final thoughts. Tom?
Thanks, Jack. To summarize everything we talked about today, common HIPAA concerns, kind of what HIPAA is, for me, really boiling it down to is being in this industry and maintaining this customer or patient data. It's our ethical responsibility to ensure that that's being protected. So I would encourage anybody out there who isn't 100% confident on their HIPAA posture, HIPAA compliance posture in their organization, to seek a gap assessment and give yourself the clarity of knowing where you are properly aligned and where you're not, and ensuring that your patient's data is protected. If my goal and my hope is that no one we work with at Charles IT ever faces the question of how do you manage our data? How do you manage our security? And one, not know the answer, but also two, be able to answer in confidence that the data is being properly stored, patient information is being properly maintained, both internally at any given organization, but also with all of their vendors and contractors that may be using or seeing that data. For me, coming back to it is also just how can Charles IT help? So if anyone's an existing client of Charles IT, reach out to your team lead and account manager and share any concerns or questions that you may have. And for anyone out there who doesn't currently have access to a gap assessment or is looking to seek one, do please feel free to reach out to Charles IT. And you can reach out to me directly for this, tom@charlesit.com, or give us a call at 860-344-9628. We're here to help. And again, we geek out over data security. That's what we're here for, and that's what we do, not just during the day, but also on our own time. So we'd love to help anybody who needs it. Just want to give another thank you, everyone, for joining today. Appreciate your time, and I'm going to turn it back over to Jack just for one final note.
Yeah, thanks again, Tom, for a terrific presentation and taking the time to answer some great questions from our audience. I would like to also thank all the attendees for taking the time to join us today on this lovely Tuesday. Just for the latest happenings, including information on any of our upcoming webinars or events, please feel free to follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram. And this officially concludes today's webinar. Thanks again for your time. Have a great rest of your day, and please stay safe.